Tēnā koutou and welcome to the NPR and Manawatū Standard By-Election special series. We have senior reporter Jimmy Ellingham from the Manawatū Standard. He'll be asking questions from listeners and readers towards the end of the interview. And in this interview series, we're talking to candidates in the Palmerston North City Council by-election, the hopefuls vying for the seat left vacant by Tangi Utikere in 2020. We are here in Hancock Community House, and our guest in this episode is Sarah Spillane. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
You have arguably been running the longest campaign in this by-election. You were the first cab off the rank.
Yes, it feels like it too. It feels like a very long time since this started.
But that obviously implies that you'd been considering this probably since early 2020, when the possibility of a by-election reared its head.
Yeah, sure. So I'm actually on the board of Freiburg High School, and I was on the board with Tangi. Tangi obviously was our board chairperson prior to becoming their MP. So I was aware of council. I was aware that there was almost certainly going to be a vacancy coming up if Tangi was successful, which he was. So yeah, it's something that has been on my radar for a while.
It's something you've referenced in your candidate statement as well, your time on various school boards, and you're citing this as a demonstration of experience for moving to council. Yeah,
sure. I think being on boards, I've been on school boards for the last 12 years, most of which I've been the chair of a board, either Milson School or Freiburg High School now. I've just taken over the chairperson role since Tangi left. I think it's a really useful experience in governance. I think being on school boards gives you a really good grounding in understanding the purpose and role of governance, which I think is really important to the role of a city councillor.
Do you think, though, by extension, that the skills will be transferable because local government standing orders are quite a different beast from school boards?
Yeah, I think there is a difference, which is probably important, but I think that there are a lot of transferable skills, the ability to work collaboratively with people, to work for the benefit of a group, even if you may have different ideas. Keeping the group you're serving as the central aspect of what you're doing. I'm always keen to learn new skills, so I have no concerns about learning the skills required for council specifically. But I think there are a lot of skills that you do pick up that are transferable. Community consultation, collaboration. I think they're all really useful things that I already have an understanding of.
We'll talk about some of the platforms that you're standing on in a moment, but are you aware also of the limitations of council? Because whilst you may stand for particular principles or specific projects, there is a likelihood that those may not even come up in conversation in City Council, in which case, it's hard for you to push those agendas.
Yeah, sure, and you're only one voice of 15 as well, ultimately. And I think you have to be realistic in what is achievable. But I think you also have to be aspirational in what you'd like to see achieved. And I think those kind of goals give voters an opportunity to understand where I come from. I'm not standing as a member of a political organisation, I'm standing as an independent. So I think it's a good opportunity to actually give people some insight into the kind of person I am and the kind of councillor I would be.
Looking at some of the pillars of your campaign, noticing you want to balance infrastructure development costs with affordability and fairness to ratepayers. The inference there is that is not happening to your satisfaction at the moment.
I think it's always quite difficult. I think we all want more and we all want more for less, but that's not always achievable. I think with infrastructure in Palmerston North currently, one of the biggest problems is, of course, the looming huge generational cost of wastewater development. I think in those kind of instances, there's a real danger of simply selecting the cheapest option and not necessarily the best option. I think we have to accept that there will be a cost associated with that. Personally, I'd like to see central government becoming more involved in those huge infrastructure development projects. I think it's unfair to simply keep whacking those costs onto rates and ratepayers. So I think we need to be a bit more creative in how we source that. Similarly, I think looking at what the best option would be, which certainly from an environmental and person-centred point of view is probably one of the more expensive options. I think really pressuring central government to come to the party with some of those costs would be vital. moving forward, the potential for environmental costs to the city with, as an effect of global changes, climate changes, for example, could see a huge necessary infrastructure, and I think it's really useful to already have a mechanism to involve central government in paying for some of that. As far as fairness for ratepayers as well, I think it's time the city actually explored different options with how we collect rates, how we determine the rates apportioned to a property. I think land values is a pretty blunt mechanism for determining that the total cost of rates. There are other options we could be looking at.
Is there evidence, and I forgive my ignorance, do other councils across the country adopt a different model, or is it largely land value?
No, not at all. Palmerston North, I think, is one of only 2 city councils that use land value.
Okay.
Most other councils use a total property value mechanism, and that's what they base it on. And I think there is certainly scope to explore other options.
Fair enough. You mentioned the wastewater treatment issue and the need, in your opinion, for central government to come to the party with that. Is that made even more relevant by the fact that the government is looking at the Three Waters reform and maybe wanting to take over entirely anyway?
Yeah, I'm not.
Is it fair for ratepayers to pay all that money now only to have it taken away in 3 years?
Yeah, no, I don't think it is, and I think we do need to be looking at central government solutions. As I said, the current, any one of those current proposals all incur a generational cost. We're looking at a kind of 20-year debt for the city, which has huge implications in the city's ability to borrow money, for example. It'll affect our credit rating for years to come. We'll be paying more for money that we're borrowing. And no, I think it is time right now, before we make a decision, to get central government's involvement. I think the economy of involving other districts as well and other cities in this is undeniable, and I think we need a more collaborative approach to solving the problem of wastewater. The quality of your water shouldn't depend on the competency of your council.
No, fair enough. So looking to other issues that are affecting the city that will come with cost, a perennial issue is footpaths.
Yep.
And Jimmy's got some questions for you on other infrastructure things as well. How are we going to balance the sheer maintenance of the city in the cost to rates?
Yeah, I think, as I said, everybody wants more for less, but the reality is things cost money. And I think for most people in Palmerston, if they can see the value of what they're paying their rates for, footpaths is a great example. By and large, they're quite well maintained. I was recently just the other night leafleting down in Highbury, coming down Monrad Street where half the pavement's shingle outside of a rest home. I think there's quite an obvious case for making sure that those pathways are accessible for people with mobility issues, for people with strollers. And I think the constantly always having to factor in the cost of it versus the practicality of people being able to enjoy the city is a bit of a false economy. We could all pay no rates and have no services. Yeah, if you want better services, it is inevitable that it will cost more money.
So with a lot of these issues, my assumption for any candidate that's standing is that you feel these things aren't being done to your satisfaction, so you want to be an elected representative of the community in order to facilitate change, but you still need a majority of those 16 voices in order to facilitate that change. Have you identified, you don't need to name names, but have you identified allies in the current councillor base or people that you think you could change their mind on some issues?
Yeah, sure. I actually know some of the councillors already personally, and I think there is a scope. I think people become councillors first and foremost because they care about the city and the people of the city. And I think there's many examples where city councillors have acted jointly and together for issues that really do affect the city. For example, the recent proposed rent increases for social housing in Palmerston North. It was really reassuring to see a unanimous vote from council to make sure that those increases don't happen. I think keeping a balance on council is really important, and making sure that council fairly and represents the different communities in Palmerston North as well. And yes, I agree. Often people become involved because there's something they'd like to change. In my case, yeah, there are things I'd like to see done differently and a different balance perhaps to our council. But also I think there's a lot of things I'd like to make sure we continue to do. Council have done some great work in a lot of spaces, social housing, community engagement. They're all things that I think are vital to ensure keep their motivation, keep going. And so it's not simply just about changing stuff. There's a lot of stuff I just want to make sure keeps happening and that we keep developing the city's commitment to those areas.
You've mentioned community engagement there as something you think the council is doing well, and yet a lot of people feel it's something that is not done well, or that the community isn't engaged, or that engaging the disenfranchised or the disinterested people is the hard thing to do.
Sorry, I should maybe split those issues out. I think engagement with community social groups has been done very well. I think Lorna Johnson particularly does a great job with her work with the community services organisations. That part of council is being done really well. Consultation with the community, I think, is a different aspect, and engaging with individuals on an individual basis, helping people understand what council is there for, fundamentally them, I think is not always done well. Unfortunately, the council just recently, there have been several examples, I can think of a couple off the top of my head, where council has sought engagement or consultation with the community or actually expert opinion, and then chosen to completely disregard that. I think when the council does that, it's not very reassuring for people that they do actually want to hear from us because they want to take to action what's important to us.
Okay, so what is the solution?
The solution to community engagement? I think, for a start, it's always easy to say people should simply be more interested, but it's up to the council to make themselves more interesting. I have seen a lot of work being done in a very constructive way around social media, for example, and engaging with people. I think that's really useful. I think there's also a case for accepting that a lot of people, if things are going fine, they're happy. People become engaged when they're unhappy often, as you've already said. I think actually making sure, and there has been a lot of work done in that space. I think a lot of the councils rebranding, the updates to their website have made things a lot clearer. And I think some councillors do it better than others, actually getting out and talking to people, getting a feeling from people of what they want. I think we need to be cautious too, though. There's no need to have a referendum on every single issue. Part of the mandate a councillor is elected with is to represent people, and you should have a very clear idea of what people want when you become elected.
Is there a need then to sort of identify what would be the more contentious issues and ensure they're brought to light? I'm thinking of example, the bottle store on Fitzherbert Avenue that no one knew was, apparently no one knew was being built until suddenly it was there, and by then it was too late for communities, if they wanted to oppose it. Yeah,
sure, and I think, there's other examples of that. The recent upgrades to the roading down in College Street, where residents weren't informed of what would be happening until the project had already started. And I think where things are obviously going to cause an issue for people, I think council does have to be more proactive about making sure people are aware of the issues and give people an opportunity to respond and actually listen to what those responses are.
Yeah. In your candidate statement, you're saying we deserve an outstanding people-centred city, which is meaningfully accessible. Are there holes in the framework at the moment, or are we there? Because I thought it was a fairly accessible city. It's very flat.
Yeah, it sure is. I actually have, for the last 15 years, worked for for Lavender Blue. So we're a home-based community support organisation. We deal with people with disabilities and older people. And I can tell you a lot of the things that seem to an able-bodied person to be accessible actually aren't. For example, public toilets that have a disabled, a mobility sticker on them doesn't actually mean they can be used. For example, there's doors that are too heavy to open if you're a wheelchair user, open outwards, so you can't actually get in and use the bathroom. Bathrooms that you actually can't have a caregiver in the bathroom, in the toilet with you to assist you if that's what you need. Shingle pathways leading up to disabled access toilets make them kind of redundant. I also care for my own mum, who's a wheelchair user, and I can tell you a lot of the car parks around Palmerston, for example, that may be labelled for mobility users are completely inadequate if you're actually a wheelchair user. You have the choice of parallel parks where a pavement completely prevents you exiting a passenger's door, or parallel parks worse, where if you're the driver, you're trying to get into a wheelchair with oncoming traffic. Even around our health services, outside the City Doctors in Victoria Street, there's nowhere for a full assist mobility taxi to stop, so that unloading and offloading wheelchair-using passengers in the middle of the road.
So just on that, the council have recently redeveloped this part of the square. Have those sort of considerations been taken into account? Is there anything that you would identify in that development that should have been
I think
more?
actually those parks are really good.
Right.
Yeah, and because they're not parallel parks, so you can actually get a wheelchair in and out on both sides. You need to be mindful too that wheelchair users particularly may be the passenger or maybe the driver, so you need to make sure you're leaving adequate space on both sides of the park. So that you've got room to bring a chair up or a mobility aid, a walking frame or you know.
So would it be fair to say then that when the council are doing new works, they are more mindful of these issues, and you'd just be advocating that they continue to be mindful of them?
Certainly with some of the public toilets, no, these are new ones that have been built with, as I said, shingle pathways leading up to the toilet. But with the roading, there does seem to have been an improvement.
Very good. We'll turn over to Jimmy Ellingham from Manawatū Standard for questions from listeners and readers.
Yes, thank you, Fraser, and thank you, Sarah. That accessibility issue sounds like something you have some expertise in.
A lot. Yes.
If you were to be elected, what would be one of the first things you'd advocate for to help with that issue? You've brought up some, I guess, problems, so how would you try to solve them?
I think too, one of the other things I haven't mentioned yet as far as accessibility is accessible housing. So what I would like to see is future-proofing our housing stock. The cost of retrofitting mobility aids or accessibility into existing houses is really, really high. So at the moment the DHB covers those costs, but if you're a renter, then actually you have to rely on your landlord allowing them to do. I'd really like to see new bylaws around new housing developments that ensure that at least a proportion of them have to be built with long-term accessibility in mind. We have an ageing population. We're all going to grow old and we're all going to need somewhere to live. So having a stock of housing that is actually built in mind for accessibility would be really useful. If you're a disabled renter, your scope for finding a property you can actually live in is really, really reduced in an already really competitive market.
And I guess we're talking about social housing, so let's look at that. Well, what's your position on social housing? Should the City Council keep its council flats, as they're called? Do we need more? And if so, you've partly answered this question. I imagine with you, they need to be accessible. What types, if you want to see more, what types of social housing should there be? You know, smaller flats or larger for families, or a mixture? A
mixture. And I really like the new builds over at Papaioa Park are fantastic. I know many people that live in those flats. It's great to see a bit of excitement and vibrance and actually building a nice community around it, particularly our age population who already struggle a lot with isolation, so it's nice to build those communities. Definitely I don't think we need fewer. I think we have an increasingly difficult rental market. I think too the role of council should be at the cheaper end of the market, I guess, to provide quality housing for people on lower incomes. Yeah, council can't solve the housing crisis by themselves. There's a huge scope for central government to do that. Also, I think council could work proactively with iwi and housing associations to actually develop housing. And before you ask, no, I would have voted against increasing rents in those council social housing.
Yes, I thought you might from your comment previously. I've got a couple of minutes left, so I'll be quite quick on these next few questions. But one of them is you've spoken about engagement, and so if you were to be elected, what would you do personally to increase that? How would you get out among the ratepayers, as it were? Well,
I've been doing a lot of that over the last couple of months. I think crucially you have to establish your own credibility as a person that does pay attention to people and listens to their concerns. So I think making yourself available as a councillor is part of it, but obviously there's only so many people a person can talk to. I think understanding, helping the council to make sure that they're widely publicising how to get in touch with them. And as I said, I think it's really disappointing when the council then does choose to ignore those opinions once it's got them. People have to feel like you've actually listened to them. It's our city. We should be listened to. Yeah,
thanks. We've got about a minute left, but I'll be quick with these ones too. Yeah. We've had a lot of questions about roading, and I think you've answered some of those questions, but one issue that comes up is cycleways, cycle facilities. What's your position on that?
I think our roads need to be safe for cyclists. I think none of us want to see kids being knocked off their bikes and killed while cycling. Palmerston North belongs to everybody, car users and cycle users alike.
And finally, one person has asked us to ask every candidate, so we will, who nominated you and who was your seconder?
I was nominated by my husband, Roger Spillane. My seconder was Linda Teruri, who is my cousin.
Thank you.
There we go. Sarah Spillane, thank you for joining us for this by-election special episode.
Thank you very much for having me.
And remember, our episodes are also available at npr.nz/show/by-election21, with the series also running during the first week of February, Monday to Friday at 9 a.m. on NPR, which is 999 AM across Manawatū, or via the live stream at npr.nz. And of course, keep an eye on the Manawatū Standard for further coverage of the candidates and their campaigns, and of course the results being announced on the 22nd of February. And remember, your vote must be posted in a DX mailbox or directly delivered to the City Council by 12 p.m. on Wednesday the 17th of February to count in the election. Thank you for joining us. Tēnā koutou.